Why people ghost you without explanation. One day the messages are flowing. The next day silence. No argument, no warning, no closure, just disappearance. Ghosting feels personal, but it usually says more about avoidance than rejection. Emotional avoidance beats difficult conversations. One day the messages are flowing. The next day there is silence. No disagreement, no final conversation, no explanation that helps make sense of the shift. Just absence. Ghosting often feels deeply personal in the moment, like a sudden rejection without explanation. But in many cases, it reflects something more uncomfortable and more ordinary. Avoidance of emotional discomfort. At its core, ghosting is rarely about a single decisive moment. It is usually the end point of someone gradually choosing avoidance over communication, and while it leaves the other person searching for answers, it often begins long before the silence arrives. A major driver is emotional avoidance. Ending or even pausing a connection requires people to tolerate discomfort, explaining feelings clearly, risking awkwardness, managing someone else's disappointment, or sitting in the emotional weight of being perceived as the one who ended it. For people who struggle with emotional discomfort, those moments can feel overwhelming. Disappearing becomes a shortcut. It removes the immediate pressure of confrontation, even if it creates larger consequences later. Closely tied to this is an inability to say no directly. Many ghosting situations begin with uncertainty rather than malice. A person may not feel strongly enough to continue, but also doesn't feel confident enough to express that. Instead of stating disinterest or setting a boundary, they delay responding. They tell themselves they will reply later, or that they are just busy. Over time, that delay becomes avoidance, and avoidance becomes silence. What could have been a short, honest message turns into nothing at all. In modern dating and social environments, another factor is the presence of multiple simultaneous connections. People often engage with several conversations or relationships at once. When attention shifts toward one connection that feels more compelling, others may fade out by default rather than by design. Instead of formally closing those interactions, some people simply stop responding. It is inefficient and emotionally careless, but it is also increasingly common in environments where options feel abundant and easily replaceable. It is also important to recognize that ghosting is often gradual on the part of the person doing it. Even if it feels abrupt on the receiving end, interest rarely disappears in a single moment. More often, responses slow down, enthusiasm decreases, and engagement becomes inconsistent before stopping altogether. By the time silence arrives, the person ghosting may already feel like the connection has naturally ended. Even if they never communicated that shift, the absence of closure is not necessarily sudden in their internal experience. It just wasn't translated into words. There is also a psychological layer involving guilt avoidance. Some people ghost not because they are indifferent, but because they care enough to feel uncomfortable ending things directly. They assume that disappearing is less hurtful than rejection. In reality, ambiguity tends to create more confusion and prolonged emotional discomfort for the other person. Still, from their perspective, avoidance feels like a way to minimize immediate guilt or conflict, even if it produces greater harm overall. Across all of these patterns, one point remains consistent. Ghosting reflects communication capacity more than it reflects personal worth. It is rarely a precise evaluation of you as a person. Instead, it tends to reveal something about the other individual's ability or inability to navigate emotional, responsibility, and uncomfortable conversations. The silence left behind is not a clear statement about your value. It is an incomplete message that says more about their coping style than your significance. Ghosting feels personal because it lacks closure, and the human mind naturally tries to fill in that gap. But in most cases, the explanation is not hidden, meaning it is avoidance. They didn't know how to say no. A surprising amount of ghosting doesn't begin with rejection, it begins with hesitation, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, everyday difficulty of saying no clearly and directly. For many people, disappearing is not a planned decision, so much as the final step in a long pattern of avoidance that started with a simple discomfort, not wanting to disappoint someone in the moment. Saying no sounds easy in theory. In practice, it forces a person to take responsibility for someone else's reaction. It may trigger guilt, awkwardness, or the fear of being seen as rude or insensitive. For people who are conflict avoidant, even a small expression of disinterest can feel emotionally heavy. So, instead of a clean refusal, they choose ambiguity. They respond slowly, vaguely, or inconsistently, hoping the situation will resolve itself without needing a direct statement. This is where ghosting often begins, not as a sudden disappearance, but as a gradual avoidance of clarity. At first, the intention is usually harmless. A person might not feel strongly enough to continue a conversation or connection, but also doesn't want to hurt the other person, so they delay responding. They tell themselves they will reply later, when they have more time, or figure out what to say. But the longer they wait, the harder it becomes to re-enter the conversation. Each delay increases the emotional pressure of having to explain the delay itself. Eventually, avoidance feels easier than honesty. Part of the difficulty comes from how people interpret rejection. Many individuals overestimate the emotional impact of a direct no and underestimate the emotional impact of silence. They imagine that honesty will feel harsh, definitive, and possibly damaging. In contrast, silence feels softer in the moment because it avoids confrontation entirely. What they don't account for is that ambiguity often creates more confusion, not less. Without a clear answer, the other person is left trying to interpret meaning where none was given. There is also a social conditioning layer to this behavior. Many people are taught explicitly or indirectly that being nice means avoiding discomfort in others. Direct rejection can feel like violating that rule. So, instead of setting a boundary, they soften it into non-action. They hope the lack of engagement will communicate the message without them having to state it. In their mind, silence can feel like a gentler alternative to rejection, even if it is actually more confusing. What makes this pattern especially common in modern communication is how easy it is to delay responses indefinitely. Digital messaging removes the immediate presence of another person, which makes avoidance feel less emotionally urgent. There is no face-to-face discomfort, no immediate reaction to manage. This distance makes it easier to postpone difficult conversations until they disappear entirely, but the cost of that postponement is clarity. When someone cannot say no directly, they often end up saying it indirectly through absence. The result is ghosting, but the underlying issue is not cruelty or indifference. It is discomfort with emotional directness. The silence is not always meant as punishment or dismissal. More often, it is a failure to tolerate the temporary discomfort of being honest. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior, but it does clarify it. Ghosting is frequently less about rejection and more about avoidance of responsibility in communication. The inability to say no creates a vacuum where clarity should have been, and in that vacuum, the other person is left to interpret silence as meaning, even though no meaning was intentionally delivered. In the end, the problem is not just saying no. It is the belief that avoiding no will create less harm, when in reality, it simply delays it and makes it more ambiguous. Directness may feel uncomfortable in the moment, but it prevents the longer, more confusing discomfort of being left without answers. You are one of multiple options. In many modern connections, dating, friendships, even casual social interactions, people are rarely focused on just one person at a time. Attention is split across conversations, apps, social circles, and possibilities that are constantly shifting. Within that environment, ghosting often happens not because someone is making a deliberate, targeted decision to reject you, but because you were one thread in a larger web that they gradually stop prioritizing. This can be an uncomfortable idea, but it helps explain a common pattern. Someone engages warmly at first, then slowly fades without explanation. From the outside, it feels sudden. From their perspective, it is often a quiet redistribution of attention rather than a dramatic cutoff. In these situations, you are not necessarily chosen against in a direct, personal way. You are simply not selected forward when priorities shifted. Many people today manage multiple overlapping connections by default. Messaging apps make it easy to maintain conversations with several people at once, often with no clear boundaries between casual interest and meaningful investment. Early-stage interactions especially tend to exist in a kind of informal queue. Some conversations develop momentum, others stall, and some remain in a low-effort holding pattern. When someone encounters a connection that feels more engaging, convenient, or emotionally stimulating, their attention naturally shifts. The other conversations don't always get an explicit ending, they just receive less energy, and because there is no formal obligation to close every interaction cleanly, people often default to silence rather than explanation. This is where ghosting emerges as a byproduct of selection, not necessarily rejection. Instead of actively deciding I am ending this with you, the person is more likely thinking, I am focusing elsewhere. The distinction matters because it changes the emotional weight of the behavior. One is a direct dismissal, the other is a side effect of prioritization. Still, the impact on the receiving end feels the same. Absence without closure. It is also important to recognize that people are often optimizing for emotional efficiency rather than fairness. Sending a clear message that they are no longer interested requires effort, discomfort, and emotional accountability. In contrast, simply not responding allows them to move on without having to manage someone else's reaction. When multiplied across several ongoing conversations, the easiest path tends to win out, even if it is socially inconsiderate. Another factor is the perception of replaceability in modern social dynamics. When options feel abundant, some individuals unconsciously treat connections as less finite. This can reduce the perceived necessity of formal closure. Instead of seeing each interaction as something that deserves a clean ending, they view it as something that can simply fade out when attention shifts elsewhere. None of this is meant to suggest that people are consciously ranking others in a cold or calculated way. More often, it is a passive process driven by attention, convenience, and emotional bandwidth, but the outcome is the same. Some connections are maintained, others are deprioritized, and some are left to dissolve without explanation. From the outside, it is easy to interpret ghosting as a personal judgment. In reality, it is frequently a structural effect of how people manage multiple social inputs at once. You were part of a set of possibilities, and for reasons that may have had little to do with compatibility or worth, attention moved elsewhere. This does not make the experience any less frustrating. What it does clarify is that silence is not always a targeted message. Sometimes it is just what happens when people are juggling more connections than they have the capacity or willingness to manage with care. They lost interest gradually, not suddenly. Ghosting often feels like it happens overnight. One moment there is steady conversation, shared jokes, and consistent attention. The next, there is silence. No explanation, no turning point that makes sense in hindsight. But in most cases, the disappearance is not actually sudden, it only feels that way from the receiving end. For the person fading out, interest usually doesn't vanish in a single moment. It erodes gradually, in small shifts that accumulate over time. The early signs are rarely obvious. Responses may become slightly slower. Messages might shorten from paragraphs to sentences. Enthusiasm subtly dips, even if politeness remains. These changes are easy to overlook because they don't signal rejection directly. Most people assume temporary busyness or distraction rather than a change in emotional investment. From the outside, nothing seems broken. From the inside, something is quietly cooling. This gradual decline is important because it shapes how ghosting feels so abrupt later. By the time someone stops responding entirely, they have often already emotionally stepped back. The final silence is not the beginning of the disconnection, it is just the point at which the disconnection becomes visible to the other person. There is also a psychological tendency to normalize fading engagement as it happens. People rarely decide, I am no longer interested in a single clear moment. Instead, they experience micro-reactions. A message that doesn't excite them as much, a conversation that feels slightly more effortful, a growing sense of neutrality instead of anticipation. None of these moments feel significant enough on their own to warrant a formal ending, so they pass without action. Over time, neutrality replaces curiosity, and once curiosity is gone, communication becomes optional rather than meaningful. Another factor is momentum. Early-stage interactions often rely on momentum consistent exchanges that keep the connection alive. When that momentum slows, it becomes harder to restart. Each delay in response slightly reduces emotional engagement, making future replies feel less urgent or necessary. What looks like sudden disappearance is often just the endpoint of a slowing cycle. People also tend to avoid explicit closure when interest fades, gradually because there is no clear event to point to. Without a specific reason like conflict or disagreement, they may feel they don't have a justified explanation to offer. So, instead of articulating a vague internal shift, "I'm not feeling this anymore in the same way," they default to silence, especially if the connection was still polite or non-problematic. From their perspective, the ending has already happened internally. They are simply not continuing it. This creates a mismatch in timing. One person experiences the decline in real time, noticing small reductions in engagement. The other experiences the end only when they stop responding altogether. That gap between internal ending and external realization is what makes ghosting feel so sudden and confusing. Importantly, this gradual disengagement is not always intentional in a conscious, calculated sense. It is often passive. Attention shifts elsewhere, priorities change, or emotional energy becomes limited. Instead of making a clear decision to end something, the person simply stops reinforcing it. Without reinforcement, most casual connections naturally decay. What remains is silence that feels abrupt, even though it was preceded by a slow withdrawal. Understanding this pattern doesn't make the experience less frustrating, but it does clarify its structure. Ghosting is often not a single moment of rejection. It is the final visible point of a process that has already been unfolding quietly for some time. They're avoiding guilt, not you. When someone disappears without explanation, it is easy to assume the silence about you, your behavior, your value, or something you did wrong. But in many cases, ghosting is less about rejecting you and more about avoiding an uncomfortable feeling on their side. Guilt. Guilt shows up when a person believes they are causing emotional discomfort in someone else. Even something as simple as saying "I'm not interested" can trigger it. For some individuals, that feeling is difficult to tolerate, not because they are necessarily unkind, but because they are uncomfortable being the source of disappointment. So, instead of confronting that emotional weight directly, they choose the path that temporarily removes it: avoidance. From the outside, silence feels cold and dismissive, but internally, the motivation is often the opposite. Many people who ghost are not trying to punish or reject you with intensity. They are trying to escape the discomfort of being the one who delivers disappointing news. In their mind, no message feels easier to manage than an honest one that might hurt someone. This is where guilt avoidance becomes powerful. The longer someone delays a difficult conversation, the more uncomfortable it feels to start it. A simple message that could have been sent early, clear, brief, and respectful begins to feel heavier over time. Now it is not just about ending a connection. It is about explaining why they didn't respond earlier, managing the other person's reaction, and sitting with the awkwardness of having avoided it in the first place. So, instead of repairing the situation with honesty, they avoid it entirely. There is also a common misconception that silence is less hurtful than rejection. People often tell themselves, "If I don't respond, I won't hurt them directly." This logic is flawed, but emotionally comforting. It reframes inaction as kindness rather than avoidance. What they underestimate is that ambiguity tends to create more confusion and prolonged emotional discomfort than a clear no. But in the moment, avoidance feels like the gentler option because it postpones guilt. Another layer is how guilt interacts with self-image. Some people want to see themselves as considerate or kind. Delivering rejection challenges that identity. Rather than risk feeling like the bad guy, they unconsciously choose silence, which allows them to delay that self-confrontation. The issue is not that they lack empathy, it is that they struggle to sit with the discomfort that comes with expressing it directly in difficult moments. Over time, this avoidance compounds. Each missed response makes the eventual message harder to send. The silence stretches not because they are actively deciding to hurt you, but because they are trying to avoid the moment where they feel responsible for hurting you. Ironically, This delay usually increases the emotional impact on the other person, even though it was originally meant to reduce harm. From your perspective, the result feels like rejection without explanation, but from their perspective, it often feels like postponing, an uncomfortable task that kept getting heavier the longer it was ignored. This is why ghosting is not always a reflection of how someone feels about you. It is often a reflection of how they handle internal discomfort. The silence says less about your worth and more about their tolerance for guilt and confrontation. Understanding this doesn't erase the frustration of being left without closure, but it does shift the interpretation. You are not necessarily being avoided because of who you are. You are often being avoided because of what they feel. When they imagine being honest, it reflects their communication skills, not your value. When someone ghosts you, the mind almost automatically searches for a reason. What did I do? What did I miss? Was there something wrong with how I showed up? That search is natural, but it often leads to the wrong conclusion. Ghosting is usually not an accurate measurement of your worth. It is a revealing signal about the other person's ability to communicate under emotional discomfort. Communication is not just about expressing interest or making plans. It also includes handling endings, discomfort, and emotional responsibility. Some people are good at the easy parts of communication, but struggle when things become awkward or emotionally charged. They can engage in conversation, show interest, and maintain connection, but when it comes time to be clear, direct, or honest about changing feelings, their skills break down. Ghosting tends to appear exactly at that breaking point. In many cases, the issue is not a lack of feeling, but a lack of tools. Saying "I'm not interested anymore" requires clarity, confidence, and tolerance for another person's reaction. It requires accepting that someone might feel disappointed, and that you might feel uncomfortable delivering that disappointment. For people who are never taught how to navigate those moments, silence can feel like the only available option. So, instead of communicating poorly and risking conflict, they avoid communicating at all. It is important to recognize how often this is about capacity rather than character. Someone can be kind, funny, or emotionally expressive in certain contexts and still lack the skill set for direct emotional closure. Modern communication habits, especially text-based interactions, can reinforce this gap. It is easy to start conversations, easier to maintain light engagement, but significantly harder to end things clearly when there is no face-to-face accountability or immediate emotional feedback. This creates a pattern where people function well in connection, but poorly in closure. Ghosting then becomes less about intentional rejection and more about avoidance of a skill they do not possess or have not developed. Instead of navigating the discomfort of a clear ending, they default to disappearance because it bypasses the need for emotional articulation. The result is silence, but the cause is often inexperience with difficult communication rather than a statement about the other person's value. From your perspective, the absence of explanation can feel personal because it leaves room for interpretation. The mind fills that space with self-directed questions, but the more accurate interpretation is often external. The person did not have the communication ability to handle the situation responsibly. That distinction matters. If ghosting were a precise evaluation of you, it would imply a level of thoughtfulness and clarity that the behavior itself contradicts. Ghosting is, by nature, an avoidant and imprecise act. It is not a carefully constructed judgment, it is an absence of communication. And absence is a poor tool for evaluating anything with accuracy. In that sense, ghosting says very little about who you are and much more about how someone handles discomfort, boundaries, and emotional responsibility. People with strong communication skills may still disappoint others, but they tend to do so with clarity. People with weaker communication skills often avoid the moment entirely, leaving ambiguity instead of closure. The difference is not in how worthy the other person is. It is in how equipped the communicator is to be honest under pressure. When you strip away the silence and the uncertainty, what remains is a simple reality. Someone's inability or unwillingness to communicate clearly is not a measure of your value. It is a reflection of their limitations in navigating difficult conversations, and those limitations belong to them, not you. At the end of the day, Ghosting rarely tells you anything precise about your value. It says more about someone's avoidance, their communication limits, or their ability to face uncomfortable conversations. And while it can feel personal, it usually isn't a message about you, it's a reflection of how they handle emotional responsibility. The hard part isn't understanding why it happens. It's accepting that sometimes you won't get closure from the other person. But clarity doesn't always come from them. It comes from recognizing patterns for what they are, not what you fear they mean about you.